Shall we start now? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session of our workshop, Wittgenstein's Philosophy in Times of Crisis. My name is Haiqiang Dai, and I will be the moderator of today's session. During the whole session, I would like to ask you to keep yourself muted. But if you like, you can turn your camera on. And also, please use your real name. I would like to tell you a few words for this workshop. It aims to bring together Wittgenstein's researchers from all around the world to reflect the current situation through the lens of Wittgenstein philosophy. It is co-organized by international Wittgenstein researchers from Japan, Germany, and China. I would like to introduce you my co-organizer and co-host today. Wei and Saori from Japan. You can see them. And Danka and David from Germany, and me from China. Today's session consists of a talk about 45 minutes, followed by a 15 minutes comment, and then a general discussion with 2 hours in total. For the general discussion, it would be helpful if you can write down your questions or comments as the Zoom's chat. So please use the chat for posing your questions, and I will read them. Now I'm very excited to introduce you our today's speaker, Professor Paul Horwich. He is not only a distinguished Wittgenstein scholar, but also has broad philosophical interests include philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of science. He has published many books, such as Truth in 1919, Meaning in 1998, Truth, Meaning, Reality in 2010, and Wittgenstein's Metaphilosophy in 2012. Today, he will give us a talk exploring Wittgenstein's thought on religion. Also, we are glad to have Professor Hiroshi Ohtani to be the commentator today. Professor Ohtani is an associate professor at Tokyo Women's Christian University. His research interests include contextualism, later Wittgenstein, history of analytic philosophy. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Horwich. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. It's a great idea. I'm delighted to be participating in it. I wish I could honestly say that my paper is strongly relevant to the topic and addressing the present crisis. I mean, I don't think it's irrelevant, but as we'll see, you'll decide for yourself. I think there is some relevance, but not very, very strong. This is a very difficult topic. I have written a fair amount about Wittgenstein, and it's always difficult, but his views are kind of elusive. But eventually, it seems to me anyway, you can get at something pretty plausible. This topic is exceptionally difficult, and part of the reason is, well, actually, I'm really beginning to talk about giving the introduction of my paper, just listing the various things that are going to be discussed in order. But the first point is that in terms of textual evidence in Wittgenstein's writings about religion, they're somewhat all over the place. A little bit here. There's something published as a book of his called Lectures and Conversations. What is it called? Lectures and Conversations on Anthropology, I don't know, Psychology and Religious Belief, or something like, or Aesthetics. That's it, Aesthetics. And but these are actually not even written by Wittgenstein. They're notes taken by his students. And so I don't know about you, probably feel the same way as me. You certainly wouldn't like people to be assessing your philosophical ideas by simply on the basis of reading the notes that your students took during lectures that you gave. I mean, it's not the most maybe reliable thing. And then in addition to that, those things which aren't even by Wittgenstein, notes of his students, you know, he kept diaries every day. He would write, you know, a diary. Sometimes they're about culture, they're about all sorts of music, about politics, and occasionally there's a remark about religion, and that's it. And then there are, you know, things that, you know, you can read remarks he made to his friends and biographical materials. So that's it. It's pretty slim, the evidence, just in terms of what Wittgenstein's written. So that's one of the things that makes it particularly difficult to, if you just go on that, you don't really have any right to have a confident view about what his philosophy of religion is or what he thought about religion. So then I'm turning to the second thing I want to talk about. I think the only way around this problem of paucity, you know, sparseness of evidence is to bring to bear to the whole thing his general philosophical commitments, the philosophical commitments of his later period. And if you then look at the remarks we do have through the perspective of that, those general commitments, then it's, you know, you at least get a better angle on what is plausibly, maybe plausibly what his views about religion were. But even there, I think there's room for a lot of disagreement. So I can't say that in the end, yeah, I'm sure I'm right, this is what he thinks. You know, I'd be much more tentative than that. Anyway, so having talked about the three commitments that I think we have to bring to bear in order to help us with the little evidence we have to get at what he thought, I will then talk about what I take to be the main elements in his philosophy of religion, his treatment of the problematic notion of religious belief. Then I want to ask the question, consider the question, whether that treatment is actually consistent with his own views about how philosophy should be done and how it shouldn't be done. It doesn't quite fit, as you will see. It's not really philosophy done in the way that he does philosophy when he's talking about language or talking about experience or talking about epistemology. So there is an interesting difference there. Is it even consistent with his general views about how philosophy should be done? Then maybe in order to help with this, there's a particularly puzzling remark that he made to one of his friends, where he says, I am not a religious man, but I can't help seeing every problem from a religious point of view. And one thinks, well, what on earth could that be? I mean, what is it to be a religious person if not to look at everything from a religious point of view? But anyway, I think maybe we can get something interesting out of that. We'll come to that towards the end. And then, but it is a question of time. I haven't really timed myself doing this, but depending on the time, I'll say something about the difference between what Wittgenstein's saying and some sort of rather somewhat strikingly similar, or at least superficially similar, views that about religion that were put forward by Pascal and Karl Marx, different from one another. So that's the plan. All right. So now, all right. So turning to section 2. What are the elements of the general perspective with which I think we should look at his explicit, scattered comments about religion? Well, I take these are views that he came to in his so-called later period. I mean, the main work is the philosophical investigations, obviously. Okay, so firstly, as I've already mentioned, this is important. There's his general view about how philosophy should be done and how it shouldn't be done. Okay, what's called his metaphilosophy, his philosophy of philosophy. Okay, now a central feature is what we shouldn't do. Philosophy shouldn't be scientistic. Okay, now scientistic isn't the same as scientific. Okay. Most philosophers, unless you're Quine or something, would agree that philosophy is not scientific. Philosophy is not science. Okay. If philosophy was science, then you may as well say philosophy doesn't exist. There's just science. And so-called philosophy is just part of it. That's all right. But anyway, so it's would be, oh, and Wittgenstein, of course, wasn't any sort of Quinian. He didn't think that philosophy was an empirical subject like physics or whatever. So when he says that it's not supposed to be scientistic, what he has in mind is that he's not supposed to try and copy science. It's not supposed to be like science. And by like it in what respects? Well, in one respect, of course, it's clearly not science. It's not like science. It doesn't, its data are different. Its data, unlike in science, are not observations, experimental results, you know. It's rather, in philosophy, something philosophers called a priori intuitions. Okay, so there is something like a priori intuitions. But then the scientistic philosophy, which Wittgenstein disapproves of, thinks that we get from those to deep philosophical a priori theories about truth, about experience, about how to live one's life, about the nature of reality, you know, about knowledge. So there are these topics, these areas of philosophy, and the idea in the traditional, fairly common scientistic philosophy that Wittgenstein opposed is that you're looking for deep, interesting, perhaps radical, showing where common sense goes wrong, radical theories. Okay, radical theories that will be justified in a way that parallels science instead of by empirical data, by these a priori intuitions. And so you're looking for a theory that fits the intuitions, and you're looking for the simplest theory that fits the intuitions, just so it emulates science, and that's scientistic philosophy. Okay. And Wittgenstein thought that that was, you know, that was a bad idea. It wasn't going to get anywhere. So what are some examples? Well, you're all familiar with the different kinds. I mean, I have just listed some. There are theories that just are supposed to correct ordinary intuitions. So for instance, I mean, I'm just using the example of truth for just for the sake of having an example, but a reformist theory of truth might be that, or part of a theory would be, if something is not verifiable, if a belief is not verifiable, or a proposition isn't verifiably true, then it can't be true. So to be true, something must be verifiable. Okay, now that's not so intuitive. That's a reformist suggestion. You know, intuitively, well, why shouldn't there be facts that we can't access, we can't verify? I mean, there are facts that certain creatures, say a fly, is not genetically equipped to access, to know anything about. So, well, we have genetic limitations too, so why shouldn't that apply to us as well? So it's not intuitive, it's a reformist view. Then there's more radical than reformists, as you know, very common in philosophy to find completely skeptical views. You know, time doesn't exist, or causation doesn't exist, or knowledge of such and such things doesn't exist, okay? Well, there are people who say absolute truth doesn't exist. Okay, that's perhaps more common than the other things. Um, do you have a question? Okay.
Hi, Professor Horwich.
Yeah.
Would you like to share your screen? We didn't see your screen.
You don't see it? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I thought I'd shared the screen. Oh, did I stop the share? Oh dear, somebody should have told me ages ago. I'm sorry, I forgot. I shared it and then I was asked to unshare it and I never started sharing it again. I'm
Okay, no
sorry.
problem.
Thank you. Thank you for, I'd have gone on forever without realizing that because it's right in front of me. And I thought, oh, how clever, you know, I can do both. I have the screen shared and I see everybody's face. But I guess that would be too good to be true. So, okay, let me do that. I guess it's this.
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to just back up so that I'm sorry for this waste of time, what I've talked about. So the first list of things were the things I said I was going to talk about. How little direct evidence there is in Wittgenstein's remarks, the need to rely on general philosophical perspectives he has. From that point of view, what are his main views of religious belief? The question whether that treatment he gives is consistent with his metaphilosophy, his puzzling remark that I read out, and then hopefully if there's time, saying something about Pascal's views and Marx's views, which are somewhat similar. Okay, then, okay, so now the first major thing was to talk about, I'm going to talk about three general later commitments of his later philosophy. And I'm talking about the first one, what is his anti-theoretical metaphilosophy, his view of the nature of philosophy according to which you shouldn't be giving theories. And that view where you should be doing theories, trying to, as it were, emulate science is known as scientism. So he was anti-scientistic, saying, of course, it goes without saying he didn't think that scientistic doesn't mean scientific. Scientific, it goes without saying that philosophy shouldn't be scientific, isn't science. But a further thing to say, nor should it be similar to science in trying to produce deep, radical, non-obvious theories that are not on the surface, but you have to infer by, as it were, inference to the best explanation of your data, what the correct theory would be, where one data are a priori intuitions. So, and then I was just talking about some of the examples of theories that Wittgenstein disapproved of, reformist theories which correct naive beliefs that we have. In the case of truth, maybe the theory that says if something is not verifiable, it can't be true or false. Then there's skeptical views. In the case of truth, of course, there are people who've argued that there's no such thing as absolute truth. That's even more radical. Reductionist views. There are people who said that the most extreme version is that reduce truth to what most people believe, as it were, a consensus theory. Truth is a matter of consensus when everybody, or nearly everybody, agrees is the case. Then a less extreme version of that is the view of Peirce, which is that it's not what everybody actually does agree to, is that if you manage in the limit of human inquiry, what eventually people will come to agree to. Okay, if you imagine inquiry going on forever, as it were, then eventually the limit will be what's true. So these are, and then there's Mysterian views. I think that's in the literature somewhere. It's basically views to the effect that a certain phenomenon is just simply intrinsically paradoxical. It's not paradoxical in a way that you can solve and understand what the puzzle is. It's just intrinsically paradoxical. It is the view that we just are never going to understand it. that maybe we aren't genetically equipped. Some people have thought that about consciousness. There are people who have definitely argued that. I think Chomsky actually introduced this notion of a mystery, namely something that we're not going to be able to, questions we're not going to be able to answer, things that we're never going to be able to understand because of genetic limitations. Okay, now Wittgenstein thinks that theory building is inappropriate because he thinks that the source of our questions and our problems in philosophy is very different from the source of the questions in science. In science, the source of our question is just ignorance. There are facts out there of a certain kind. We don't know what they are, and we want to find out what they are. So we're ignorant, and we try and reduce our ignorance by making these scientific discoveries. But Wittgenstein's view, that's not the source of philosophical questions. There, the source is confusion on our part. Okay. We just confuse ourselves. We make silly mistakes. We exaggerate analogies between different things. We overgeneralize, and we end up in a mess. We end up with a paradox. And so the way forward is to come to see the mistakes that we were making that prompted these questions in the first place, what he would call pseudo questions. They seem to be at first genuine questions. There is some ignorance, we want to find out the answer, but in fact, and what's characteristic of philosophy is that the questions are not genuine questions, and we've got to, the progress is not to, as it were, solve the problems, but as he would say, dissolve the problems. So you come to understand the confusion that led you to the question, and the question disappears. And so you don't end up with any kind of theory. All you end up with is a certain, tendency not to get mixed up, not to be confused, at least on that matter. Okay, so that's going at it on the basis of a theory is just completely the wrong approach. Okay, now so much for that. The second general commitment of Wittgenstein's that we must bear in mind, I think, is what we might call his pragmatic linguistic pluralism. So he sees language as an instrument. It's there to help us do various things, but it's not a single thing, it's a multi-purpose, instrument. Have you ever, any of you heard of or ever encountered something called a Swiss Army knife? It's a kind of special penknife which has lots of different things that come out of it to do different jobs. So language is like that. It's got to do lots of jobs. So our overall discourse, we divide it into lots of different subject matters, lots of different topics, lots of different areas. There's history, physics, ethics, medicine, aesthetics, the law, religion, all sorts of areas. And these have different kinds of importance. They have different ways of being useful to us. And so their function for us, why we bother to engage in them or be interested in them, varies from one to another. And insofar as the function varies, not surprisingly, the kind of norms that fix, when you have a reasonable belief or when you're making a reasonable assertion and when you're not, are likely and actually do vary to some degree from one area to another. So the methodology, in my example at the end, the methodology for finding out what's true or what's plausible to believe in physics is very different from the methodology for finding out what's plausible to believe in ethics. Okay, so we shouldn't be just looking, it would be, as it were, a philosophical blunder of the sort that Wittgenstein emphasizes, namely overgeneralization. trying to make things overly simple, because in science, of course, you want a simple theory. So if you're being scientific, you want, everything to be as simple as possible, and you overreach to the simplicity that you're ignoring actual differences. Okay, so one of the mistakes, and it's particularly relevant in the area we're talking about, is to assimilate these areas to one another, to think, oh, religion is in some ways like physics, for instance. Claims in the topic of religion about the existence of God and so on should be assessed in the way that we assess claims about the existence of electrons. This is the kind of mistake, because we're not taking into account the pluralism of the different domains of language. Okay, that's the second thing. Then the third thing is, of course, his characteristic view of meaning, the idea that the meaning of a word is its use. So, briefly, if we're talking about a word in a language, Wittgenstein, of course, he agrees with Frege that the meaning of a word is not usually the thing to which the word refers. Okay, so it's not something out in the world that the word stands for. It's not some kind of mental image or other mental phenomenon that pops into your mind every time you use the word or every time you hear the word. Rather, a word has a use in the language. And we think of it as there being a rule, a regularity or rule governing its use. And that's what the meaning is. Or putting it more precisely, the fact that the word has the particular meaning it does consists at an underlying level, or is reducible to the fact that the word is used in accordance with a given rule, a certain rule, and you'd have to spell it out, what it is. Okay, so for instance, I was talking earlier about truth, but so in my own earlier work, so I argued that in the case of the word true, the rule governing its word use that's responsible for its meaning, what it does, is that we accept we're inclined to accept every instance of the schema P, the proposition that P is true if and only if P. So we accept that the proposition that snow is white is true, just in case snow is white. And similarly, the proposition that lying is wrong is true, just in case lying is wrong, and so on. So there's this general formula, and our respect for that formula, our acceptance of any instance of that formula shows that that's how we understand the word true correctly. It's not a definition, okay? It's a rule a rule of use. But like a definition, it purports to fix the meaning. So some words get their meanings not from definitions, not like bachelor is unmarried man, okay, that's a definition, but by virtue of a rule or regularity for how it's used. So that's for words. Now, what about complex expressions that are made up of words stuck together, like a sentence? How are the meanings of those things? Well, I should have said, I missed out the second thing. So there's an analogy between the way he's thinking of the meaning of a word and something like a piece in a game, like chess. Okay. What makes a certain shaped piece in chess the queen? Okay, it's not the shape. Okay, you can make chess pieces in any arbitrary shape. Maybe certain conventional shapes are used for the king and the queen and the pawns in different parts of the world. But the main thing that makes the thing the queen is the rules for how you're allowed to move it. And similarly with a word, what gives it its meaning is not the noise, or the way it's written down, but the rule for how to use it. Okay. Now for sentences, I think he would say, now this is just a conjecture on my part, he doesn't actually say it. He doesn't address the question, well, what about the meanings of sentences? But the natural thing to think is that the meaning of a sentence consists in the meanings of the words in it and how those words have been combined with one another. So if you have, for instance, you know, a sentence in English and a sentence in German, and you find that the words in the English sentence have certain meanings and they're put together in a certain way, and then you look over at the German sentence and you find that in that sentence too, the different words though have the same meanings as the English words, and those words are put together in the same way as the way the English sentence is, then you would say the German sentence has the same meaning. And that's how translation works, obviously. Once you've translated the words of a language, then, you know, it's relatively simple matter to translate the sentences. I say Wittgenstein, I think, plausibly would have accepted that view because that very naive view, in contrast with the more theoretical views about, you know, that's actually more common these days in linguistics and even in philosophy of language, which is truth theoretic semantics following Davidson. I think Wittgenstein would have been opposed to that, just as he's opposed to any philosophical theories. And that's the view whereby the meaning of a sentence is its truth condition. Okay. Anyway, so I have to add, I've been oversimplifying a bit. Wittgenstein does appreciate that the word meaning itself is, as it were, ambiguous. So it has a cluster of distinct but related meanings. One of them is the meaning that's constituted by the word's use. And I think he thinks of that as the fundamental one. But there are other things that you can mean by meaning. So for instance, it is possible in ordinary language, it's not a mistake in ordinary language to use the word meaning for reference sometimes, okay, for the thing that's the word stands for. I mean, I can say perfectly correctly in English, you know, when English people use the expression Big Ben, what they mean is the clock above the Parliament building in London. Well, that's a perfectly correct use of the word meaning, but it's not meaning as use, it is meaning as reference. Okay. Wittgenstein would say, yeah, okay, that's, you can't. Of course, he doesn't believe in philosophy changing ordinary language. So ordinary language is sacrosanct in a way, so that's perfectly fine. But he would say that the more fundamental notion of meaning, from which you can explain reference in the end, is meaning as use. Another notion of meaning for sentences is implicature, you know, a notion introduced by Grice, where you sort of convey something without actually saying it. So I think for one of the examples is if somebody asks me, where's so-and-so? And I say, well, she's either at home or in her office. Okay. Well, what I'm conveying without actually saying it is I don't know which of those two. Okay. I mean, it'd be highly misleading if I actually knew she was at home for me to answer the question by saying, well, either she's at home or she's in her office. Although from a logician's point of view, I would be saying something, you know, maybe equally true, but it's something conveyed, not actually said, implicated. I'm conveying that I don't know which of those two it is. All I know is that it's one or the other of those two. And then, of course, there's metaphorical meaning, which is not the literal meaning. That's another kind of meaning, which isn't so clearly a matter of use. If I say, oh, Frege was the father of analytic philosophy. Well, father, really? Is that literally the meaning of father? There's some kind of metaphorical thing going on there. Okay, and what's that? So so there are these different notions of meaning. So let's, Wittgenstein, of course, his main thing was to be against oversimplification. You think of a few cases, you find something that works, and that's your theory, and you don't think of all the nuances and different contexts where the theory doesn't work. And actually, language is very, very complicated. That's why no theory is going to work. It's just too complicated. Okay, now another notion that'll be more important here. I'm feeling I'm taking too much time. I'm going to have to speed up. There's a notion of intended communicative significance. So the idea is that you can have a sentence type with a certain specified literal meaning, but its meaning in this further sense of communicative significance will vary with the particular kind of context in which it occurs, depending on whether it's, for instance, in a science journal, or just idle chatting with a friend, or in the theater, or in religious discourse. In some sense, meaning varies. Okay, so one well-known example is the sentence, France is hexagonal. The shape of France is a hexagon. Well, in a certain kind of context, that's, relaxed chit-chat context, that's true. But in another context where a certain degree of precision is expected, then of course it's not really a hexagon. The lines are kind of not really, very roughly speaking, it reminds you of a hexagon, something like that. So the different context can make a difference to what actually you're saying. Or, if I say, or take the sentence, Superman can fly. Well, said in a movie, that's kind of true. That's okay. Said about, I don't know, the real world, as it were, no. So anyway, so we have when somebody says something on a stage in the theater, what's meant, what's intended to be conveyed is not the same thing as somebody saying exactly the same thing in a science conference. Okay, there's a different intention behind it. The context is very different. We're not supposed to go out of the theater believing, in the standard sense, everything we've been told by the people on the stage, as if they're, there's a difference between a story, when you're telling a story, and when you're trying to tell somebody what actually happened in history. Okay? These contexts are important. There's a certain intended communicative significance that varies, even though the literal meaning of the sentence used may be the same. Okay. All right, I'm going to run on. The idiolectical meaning doesn't really matter here. Okay, so what are Wittgenstein's views? Now, first of all, I should say, of course, that although his personal focus and all his remarks really have to do, pretty much all his remarks have to do with Christianity. But, of course, they're interesting insofar as they apply to other religions too. And I mean, I'm not an expert in other religions, and maybe one of you can correct me, but I think they do apply to other religions as well as Christianity, all the religions. Okay. All right. Now, what I want to talk about now, first of all, is the Bible narrative, and a couple of ways of understanding it. Let me go on to that. I'm going to read out something, a kind of an account. Sorry, let me just have this ready. Okay, now, so let me ask, I want you to imagine, this is a kind of thought experiment, two distinct people. Both of them accept the following sentences. They both accept the following sentences, exactly the same thing. And this is a biblical narrative. There is a conscious being that we call God, who created the universe, or at least the rest of the universe, that is, other than himself, who is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly benevolent, who wishes us to obey specified ethical principles, which, therefore, we ought to obey, since that's what he wants, who rewards those who do obey with eternal bliss, eternal happiness in the afterlife, and punishes those who don't obey with eternal torment, who hears our prayers and sometimes grants them, who occasionally brings about miracles, that is, exceptions to the laws of nature that God had legislated, who had a son by immaculate conception, born in Bethlehem. And this was about 2,000 years ago, and was eventually killed by the Romans, but was resurrected 3 days later. Okay. Now, I'm imagining two individuals. One I'm calling Peter, I'm just making these names up, and the other I'm calling Mary. And they say exactly the same thing. They both say those things. But I'm imagining there's the following crucial difference between them. Okay. One of them, Peter, he takes his sentences when he says these things to express a literally correct historical narrative. You know, on day one, God did this. On day two, God did that, and so on. This is supposed to be literally what happened in history, and you know, how the earth was created, and so on. And this narrative, these claims that he's making, taking them to be historically correct, is something that he himself would agree should not be accepted without adequate supporting evidence. But of course, Peter himself happens to think that it is in fact well supported by evidence. That's why he says these things. But he understands that shouldn't be accepted without the evidence. In other words, he takes his claim to provide a well-conformed, well-confirmed theory. You know, now why? Well, perhaps he agrees with one of the sort of notorious or famous proofs of the existence of God. Perhaps he accepts the testimony of people who claim that God has appeared to them. Perhaps he's moved by the fact that strikingly many of the unlikely things he's prayed for have actually come true. Now, unsurprisingly, given Peter's attitude, he is highly sensitive to the prospect of counter-evidence. He would be deeply troubled at being presented with inconsistencies within the theory, or with fallacies in the alleged existence proofs, or with historical records indicating that there was in fact no person who did the things that the Bible relates of Jesus Christ. And he feels the need to find some fault with Darwin's account of evolution and with other widely accepted scientific theories that conflict with his religious claims. Okay, so that's Peter. Okay, now for the other hypothetical person who I'm calling Mary, although she comes out with exactly the same sentences as Peter, she regards them in a very different way. Mary proclaims them without the slightest hesitation or uncertainty, allowing absolutely no room for doubt. She holds that any consideration of evidence is completely irrelevant to her, and that counter-evidence is also inconceivable. In addition, Mary has fundamental, unshakable, non-cognitive attitudes, feelings, emotions, desires about humanity, about suffering, about how to live her life, about how to treat others, how to feel about nature, about death, about the very existence of the universe. These attitudes of hers are not the result of her having been persuaded by what she takes to be evidence that the Bible's historical narrative is correct. Rather, for her, it's her non-cognitive attitudes, those feelings that are explanatorily basic. They provide, and the verbalized commitments that she makes are simply a projection of those attitudes. They're providing a sort of literary presentation, an expression of those attitudes. So the narrative illustrates these attitudes by describing situations in which people have them and what happens to those people. So it's a kind of a literary, extension of the attitudes, just an illustration of the attitudes. That's how she thinks of it. And that's why she says the same things that Peter says. Now, so I invented this story, this thought experiment to illustrate Wittgenstein's view. Now, let me, sorry, where am I? I'm not. Please, somebody wave at me if I forget to continue with the screen sharing. Okay, so yeah, Wittgenstein's view. He is completely against Peter's way of being religious. He thinks it's a misconceived, even ridiculous, ludicrous. Why? Well, it's somehow absurd. Clearly, Peter doesn't really have the evidence that he himself thinks is required. And it is, in fact, the narrative. There are these inconsistencies, absurdities. It couldn't even be true in a way. There's paradoxes, there's in Christianity, the doctrine of the Trinity, where, somehow God can be this ethereal being, but also come down to earth and take the form of a human being, or Jesus Christ. And the Trinity, I'm sure some of you know more about this than me, but it's, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. They're somehow three, and they're also one. So that's one puzzle. Then there's the famous problem of evil. Since God is all-powerful and perfectly benevolent, that is, wanting people to be happy and so on, how is it allowed that in earth there is such a thing as the terrible evils that have occurred? Like the Holocaust or whatever, lots of other things you can mention. So anyway, Wittgenstein says that that's not the right way to be religious, and he's much more sympathetic with Mary's way. He thinks in a way, Peter's way is scientism. It's a scientistic way of being religious. It's somehow seeing religious discourse as if it has to be like history or like science, requiring the same kinds of evidence and believed in exactly the same kind of way. And so, just to quote here, Wittgenstein himself says, the point is, if there were evidence, he's talking about evidence for Jesus Christ and all the stuff that's said in the Bible, this would in fact destroy the whole business. It would destroy it for him. That would be, that's not, what I'm interested in. Not interested in discovering more facts. Anything that I normally call evidence wouldn't in the slightest influence me. So this is showing that Wittgenstein is aligning himself with Mary, not with Peter. And he says, religious faith and superstition, sorry, where am I? What's my? Are quite different. Okay. The one, which I think he has in mind something like Peter-style belief, religious belief, springs from fear and is a sort of false science. The other, which is Mary-like belief, is a kind of faith or trusting, a kind of an attitude, an acceptance for different reasons. Sometimes he distinguishes between the biblical narrative being embraced by the heart is distinguished from its being embraced by the intellect. Okay, that's a nice, I think, way of expressing the difference. Now, I don't know, I'm struck by, so Peter-style religious belief is like believing in, ghosts or witches or telepathy or magic or something like that. It's a superstition. False science. Okay. And, it's false cosmology to say, to think, no, the way that the earth was formed was, as it says in the Bible, rather than that it was formed by matter being spun off the sun or something like that. So it's false science. Peter's view is just, false science, superstition. I'm curious myself, I don't know, we can maybe talk about in discussion is why he says it springs from fear. How does it spring from fear? Maybe he's talking about, this is just a guess, interested in what you guys think. Maybe he's thinking it's something like fear of disease, fear of starvation. These fears that are to some extent dealt with, removed or diminished by thinking that one understands how the world works and so knows how to influence it in a way to avoid those things. Maybe by praying, you can influence it, or by making human sacrifices or whatever sacrifices to the gods or whatever. So I'm not sure. I mean, that's just a guess about why you say it springs from fear. Okay, so now, sorry, I'm just lost in my notes a bit. Okay. All right, so now here's my comment about blaming Mary for her unjustified beliefs. So, yeah, one might think, well, look, how come Mary says these things? And she has no justification. She says she doesn't need it and not interested in it, and Wittgenstein too. How is that can be okay? And part of I think the answer is that because, it's mixing up language games. Religious statements are not supposed to have the same import as statements in history or statements in science. They're judged by they obey different norms. And an extreme way of putting that point is by comparing them with novels. The author of the Sherlock Holmes stories, Conan Doyle, it would be somehow ridiculous to blame Conan Doyle for not having justified his statement that Sherlock Holmes lived in London. And blaming him for ignoring the fact that there's no record of the birth of Sherlock Holmes. And so on. This is just somehow completely missing the point. It's a story. There isn't this game of justification that takes place in what he's coming out with. So that raises the question, though, well, could Wittgenstein really have thought that the Bible is just like a story? I mean, he doesn't say that. I mean, I think on the face of it, a story, one might think, well, a novel, a piece of fiction is quite different from, one might think, obviously too different from something like the Bible for it to provide a reasonable analogy. Because surely when people make religious claims, they put them forward as true. Whereas in a novel, when you're writing, you're not putting these things forward as true. It sounds reasonable to say that, but I'm not sure one can get away with that so quickly because, given, I mean, if I'm talking to my young niece about the Sherlock Holmes stories, and she says, asks me, is it true that he lived in London? Now, knowing we're talking about the stories, I'd say yes. And she knew perfectly well what I meant. So we can use truth and falsity in that kind of context when we're talking about novels. Also, another thing you might think, well, that couldn't be that it's anything that the Bible is supposed to be like a novel because, coming out with, when somebody makes religious pronouncements, they're intended to convey belief and provoke belief, whereas nobody's not supposed to believe what you read in a novel. even that, I think, is not so clearly a solid point. After all, you know, what makes a great novel enjoyable and gripping is that you do kind of get into it, and there is a kind of belief. You, in some sense, have a sort of belief. You're gripped by it, you know. You, in some sense, believe it, you know. But it's not a normal kind of belief. It's a kind of a, we might call it a sort of an imaginative belief. There is a kind of commitment you make. It's not the normal form of belief. So I don't think it's out of the question, and we'll come back to this later, that Wittgenstein did think that there was a reasonable analogy. Not that it's exactly the same thing between a biblical narrative and a work of fiction. Okay. But in some sense, in putting it in philosophical jargon, there may be a reasonable attitude to the Bible is to be a fictionalist about it. You know, slightly in the way that some people are fictionalists about science. Not to think it is a work of fiction, but to have a certain attitude towards it, which could be called fictionalism. Okay, now, so coming back to the handout, so what did Wittgenstein think is a valuable function that could be performed by religious pronouncements? And what sort of significance or meaning did he think that religious pronouncement have, and what sort of believing does he, think is involved? I've already said something about these matters. Okay. Mary, him, and he's identifying with her, is embracing a narrative picture that illustrates and expresses her normative attitudes. I've already said this. Okay, all these things. So she's expressing these attitudes. What is the benefit she gets? I think Wittgenstein thinks there is a certain relief from certain inner torments that tormented him. A sense of meaninglessness, his life is meaningless, purposelessness, insecurity, a sense of being all alone. In the deeper sense, it's not that you don't have any friends or anything, but in some more fundamental sense. We'll come back to all this, but he himself, in CV, is Culture and Value, page 73, he describes this embrace of religion in an approving way as a rescue from one's hopeless situation. And the hopeless situation is being tormented by these things I just mentioned. Okay. So it does seem as if he thinks there is a kind of a pragmatic, prudential reason for embracing in this particular kind of like fictionalist way the Bible narrative, and using it also to illustrate and express your attitudes to various things in life. Now, I've already gone on for too long, haven't I? How long have I gone on? Gone on for an hour, haven't I, almost? I should speed things up. We're going to be too late. So I'm going to miss out some things. I'm sorry. There's nothing, I'm not going to miss out anything crucial. But these are different forms of believing. So, okay, I want to not miss out the things that Hiroshi is going to be asking me about. So, okay, Well, I've already mentioned the difference between literal semantic meaning and intended communicative, communicative intention, communicative and significance that's intended. That's important. The different ways of believing. I'll just quickly run. There's a notion of believing that's just connected to what you'll say yes to, what you'll come out with, and what you'll endorse. You believe it. Assent believing. Very superficial. You verbalize, you say yes. Deeper notion of believing, I'm calling it instrumental believing, is where you don't just verbally articulate it, but internally you rely on the sentence as premises in theoretical and practical reasoning. The main thing actually is practical reasoning and the theoretical reasoning that serves practical reasoning in making decisions. So that's for the sake of believing, for the sake of action, or for deciding what to do. Okay, which is a deeper thing than just saying yes. A third form of believing is believing which is just has an expressive purpose, like Mary's, in some sense, believing these things, saying these things in order to express her attitudes. And there's the kind I was just mentioning. It occurs when one is powerfully gripped by a novel, completely immersed in it, emotionally affected by it. You know, you care about the characters. So this is, I'm calling imaginative believing. And I'm suggesting that maybe that's the kind of believing that Wittgenstein endorses towards the religious narrative, rather than say instrumental believing, which is what Peter has. Then there's a certain kind of thing he mentions called implicit believing, where you don't have any verbalization, either internal or external. You just act as though you deeply believe it. So your actions show a kind of implicit belief where you yourself have no disposition or no inclination to verbalize it internally or externally. Okay, so I don't want to I'm going to just go fast, sorry. All right, what about the question, is Wittgenstein internally consistent here? Is what he's doing with respect to religion consistent with his metaphilosophy? I'm inclined to say yes, because of course he is against scientism and in his philosophy of religion. It is a clarificatory enterprise. It's conservative, at least with respect to philosophically innocent practices. I'll come back to why that's important. Okay, but now the two problems one might find. There seems to be, very strongly seems to be a conflict between Wittgenstein's conservatism. He's not supposed to be, doing positive things and changing practices, linguistic practices and behavioral practices. His philosophy is supposed to be merely clarifying things, removing confusion. But he is doing something. He is condemning, perhaps the most common perspective on religious doctrines in all the different religions. This is a very natural, common way people do believe. Many people do believe in, say, the Bible or in sacred texts in other religions, as if they're just like historical, almost scientific facts. This is the way things are. So isn't there some conflict between his conservatism which is, he says that you're supposed to do philosophy, leaving everything the same, and what he's actually doing in this case. So let me just address that first before I come to the other one. I think that there is a response to this, which is that Wittgenstein's view isn't entirely conservative. Even within philosophy itself, even internal to his metaphilosophy, there's his view about how philosophy should be done, but there's also his view about how it shouldn't be done. And this is a way that a lot of people actually do it. So he is not averse in his metaphilosophy to criticizing certain practices or views that he takes to be based on confusion. And I guess he would say that this scientific way of seeing religion is based on confusion. So in just the way that he would criticize certain forms of philosophizing, consistently with his metaphilosophy, of course, that is his metaphilosophy, an integral part of it. Similarly, he's allowed to criticize and reject those Peter-like ways of being religious. All right, so that's one issue, but there's another issue that's puzzling, slightly different. Look, he does advocate a positive, his view of his treatment, his way of approaching philosophy of religion is very different from his way of approaching issues in language and metaphysics and epistemology and so on. There, in the normal cases where he's, you see in the Philosophical Investigations and other works on certainty, his diagnosis of the problem is always confusion, overgeneralization, exaggerating analogies beyond, there is an analogy, but people exaggerate it, So you recognize the confusion by the way in which you come to see that you're violating ordinary language, oversimplifying, violating ordinary language. And then you remove the confusion and you're done. That's the value of it, just getting unconfused. Okay. But that's not what he's doing in the case of religion. He's not saying that what's wrong with Peter's view is that it violates ordinary language. Rather, he's saying, no, there's a much better way of being religious, one that's more intellectually respectable and really valuable, beneficial to us. So he has in mind Mary's style way of being religious and thinking, that's better. And that's the problem with the scientific view, is that it's criticized as, in light of that better way of being religious. You can't say it's making the same mistake as somebody who's, because you can't say that it's part of ordinary language to, Mary's view. It is a bit, it's a view that Wittgenstein has. So one might say, well, is he allowed to promote positive views like that? And I'd say, well, it's not so obvious that his metaphilosophy forbids it, because the positive view isn't a theory. What he's urging, when he urges people to be religious in this particular way, he's not giving a theory, he's giving a piece of advice. Okay, and so, it's not strictly speaking then inconsistent. He is allowed to give advice. Now, as a final criticism of him, you might say, okay, you can give advice, but that's not philosophy, giving advice. So maybe we shouldn't think of that part of what he's doing as actually part of his philosophy, but just somehow in something independent. It's like having a view about ethics or what you should do, what you shouldn't do. That's not his philosophy. But certainly he had a lot of ethical opinions. but he would never, just write them down in a philosophy book. So maybe that's the way we should think of his view of religion too. On the other hand, so we could reach that conclusion. It's not supposed to be philosophy for him. A point on the other side is, we shouldn't forget his famous conception of family resemblance terms or family resemblance concepts, like game is a paradigm example. Concepts where, there's no definition, no necessary and sufficient conditions for the word applies, but, the different things that are games, each thing bears certain similarities to other things which are games, and other things, and there's family resemblances, but there's no necessary and sufficient conditions. There's no determinate fact of the matter. When you say something is a game, you're saying it's similar to the other things I'm calling games. But similar, well, that's vague and context dependent, so there could be no definite fact of the matter. Well, maybe he would think philosophy also is a family resemblance term. Nobody owns it, the word. And so maybe this, is something that could be called philosophy. Okay, now quickly this. What about Wittgenstein himself? Obviously, he disagrees with Peter's way. Can we identify his way of being religious with the way I, describe that Mary is religious? Then we have the remark he made to his friend Maurice Drury. I'm not a religious man, but I can't help seeing every problem from a religious point of view. Like, how can we resolve that puzzle? What does he mean by a religious person, and what does he mean by somebody who sees problems from a religious point of view? I don't think we can say, well, he's, by religious person, he means someone like Peter, and by seeing things from a religious point of view, he means someone like Mary, because he's obviously very critical of Peter's position. It's a ridiculous position. So I don't think he'd think it was ridiculous to be a religious person. And I don't think he would think that Mary wasn't a religious person, but only, looks at things from a religious point of view. So what I suggest as a positive proposal for dealing with this puzzling remark is that when he talks about somebody being a religious person, he does indeed have in mind someone like Mary, someone who identifies with an institutional religion, not necessarily Christianity, some other institutional religion, who respects the authority of its leader or leaders, who regularly, frequently goes to the communal services, if there are any in that religion, who recites standard prayers that everyone is supposed to recite, who does embrace the biblical narrative or some analogous sacred text, and who has the ethical attitudes that are urged in that text. In the case of Mary, some bunch of things, respecting the 10 Commandments, turning the other cheek, as they say in the Bible. Somebody slaps you, you ask to be slapped on the other cheek, or you don't hit them back. Being humble, modest, God-fearing, horrified by suffering, blah, blah, blah. So that's for what it is for Mary to be a religious person. And I think that when Wittgenstein speaks of himself as, in contrast, merely someone who always sees problems from a religious point of view, what he has in mind is somebody that he's in some ways like Mary, but not completely. He does embrace the Gospels in his way, in his kind of fictionalist way. He does feel compelled to, he does have the core ethical attitudes of Mary. He does feel compelled and drawn to express his attitudes using theological notions such as sin redemption, so on. And he does articulate life's problems in those terms. So to that extent, he's like Mary, but in other ways, he's not. So for Wittgenstein, it isn't important. He doesn't sign on to some official religion. He doesn't attend religious services. He doesn't recite prayers. He doesn't obey the dietary laws. He doesn't accept, whatever the Pope says, this kind of thing. So I think that's why he said to Drury that he doesn't take himself to be a religious man. Okay. I would, if I can, just be given a little bit more time. I've saved some quotations from Wittgenstein to the very end. I just think they're very nice and sum up her views. So I'm going to go a little bit over. I'm sorry about that. So, but it does illustrate some of the things I've said, I think confirm them. So this is all from his diaries. So in 1937, he said, Christianity is not based on a historical truth. Rather, it offers us a narrative, historical narrative, and says, now believe. Okay, but not believe this narrative with the belief appropriate to a historical narrative. Rather, believe through thick and thin, which you can do only as the result of a life. Here you have a narrative. Don't take the same attitude to it as you take to other historical, really historical narratives. Make a quite different place in your life for it. There is nothing paradoxical about that. Okay. So, now, so he's thinking a narrative is not supposed to be history, although it reads like one, but don't think of it in that way. Think of it in another way. Think of it as something you use to guide yourself. Okay, you have a kind of some sort of belief. It says believe. He uses the word believe it, but not in the historical way. Okay, and then he adds to this, queer as it sounds, weird as it sounds, the historical accounts of the Gospels might, historically speaking, be demonstrably false. And yet, belief, at least his style of belief, would lose nothing by this. Not, however, because it concerns the universal truth of reason, not because it's in any way supposed to be a priori. Rather, because historical proof, the historical proof game, is irrelevant to that kind of belief that he wants. The message, the Gospels, is seized on men believingly, i.e. lovingly. That's what I said, an embrace of the heart, not the intellect. That is the certainty characterizing this particular acceptance as true, not something else. A believer's relation to those narratives is neither the relation to historical truth, probability, nor yet to a theory consisting of truths of reason. There is such a thing. Parentheses. We have quite different attitudes, even to different species of what we call fiction. You see, now there I take him to be in a way confirming my suspicion that we're allowed, even for fiction, even for something which is paradigmatically fiction, there are different ways we can use it. We can think of fiction not just as entertainment. It can be an educational experience to read a book. It can be, a guide to life. It can present role models for you. It can be an inspiration. And so I think that's, confirming the idea that Wittgenstein is thinking that we have, in a way, a certain, we could call it fictionalist view of the biblical narrative. Okay, I've gone on too long. I'm sorry, I apologize. let me stop. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Horwich.
Yeah.
This is a very excellent talk, very insightful and rich. I think our next part is a comment by Professor Ohtani.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Yeah, I prepared the written comment, which is based on a full paper. So some of the point I refer to in the comments may not have corresponding part in the handout. Also, page numbers I mentioned in this comments comes from the full paper, not from the handout. But anyway, I'm going to read my comment. Okay. I start. Paul Horwich developed an interesting interpretation of Wittgenstein's view of religious belief based on his previous work on Wittgenstein metaphilosophy. Especially, Horwich provides an interesting conception of the norms of our practices, according to which different practices are governed by different norms for beliefs and assertions. He argues that some of those norms, including the norm of religious practices, are not evidential in their nature. Also, he provides a very interesting view of the role of religious beliefs with subtle distinction on the ways of believing. In my opinion, Horwich's paper is an important contribution to Wittgenstein scholarship by a world-leading philosopher. Today, I have 5 comments. Maybe, Paul, you don't have to answer all of them because some of them are related to the point you do not talk much, you know.
Yeah, but they're all good comments. I will answer them.
Okay, thank you. But I have 5 comments, and 3 of them are clarificatory, and 2 are a bit critical, but they are not so much objection as worries to the picture of religion Horwich provides. Okay, first comment. I am not clear on the distinction between the literal meaning of an expression type and intended communicative significance. Horwich explains the distinction by saying the meaning of a given sentence type with a given literal meaning will vary with a particular kind of context within which it occurs. This is page 2 of handout. So it is conceived that the particular context of the use of a sentence takes one from the literal meaning of a sentence to its communicative significance. However, I'm not clear how the process is conceived. Is it a process that takes one from one proposition to another, or is it conceived that the literal meaning of a sentence lacks a propositional content, and the context of utterance determines the proposition of what is said in that particular context? So I'm just curious if Paul commits to the radical contextualist view of the relation between the literal meaning and proposition. Anyway, the second, I'm also not clear about the distinction between assent believing and instrumental believing. According to Horwich, a person who has an assent belief is disposed to say yes to the sentence expressing the belief, while a person who has an instrumental belief uses a belief mentally as premises in theoretical and practical reasoning. Here I am a bit puzzled because a person who sincerely says yes to a belief would use it as her premise in reasoning. For example, if a person says yes to the sentence, "It is going to rain today," she should reason on the belief. For example, she should bring her umbrella with her. If she behaves as if she does not believe that it's going to rain, we would judge she was inconsistent or her assent was insincere so that she didn't really believe it. Therefore, a person who has an assent belief thereby also has a corresponding instrumental belief. or so it seems to me. Okay. Third, I am a bit unclear about implicit believing as well. Horwich explains this notion by saying that a person has an implicit belief when she lives as if she instrumentally accepts a sentence, but without in fact explicitly accepting a sentence and without reasoning with it, either overtly or internally. He mentions Wittgenstein's example of someone who has no disposition to say there will be a last judgment, but tends to see everything in terms of a reward or punishment. It seems to me that this allows us to say that someone who is outside the Christian tradition implicitly believes the last judgment. So for example, a person who explicitly has a faith in Buddhism can nevertheless be said to believe in the last judgment. Perhaps this conception of implicit believing leads to a kind of religious pluralism, according to which various religious traditions aim at one common insight. This may be misunderstanding on my part of Horwich's view of implicit believing, but if I am correct here, his view leads to an interesting, though highly controversial view on the religious diversity. Okay, anyway, to clarify these 3 points is important because Horwich characterizes the gulf, this is the Wittgenstein phrase, gulf between a Mary-like believer and a Peter-like believer by these different kinds of meaning and believing. And to clarify these points makes us see how fideistic Horwich's Wittgenstein is. You know, the problem of fideism is a main focus of the discussion in Wittgenstein scholarship. So I'm just curious, Paul accept the fideistic characterization of Wittgenstein's philosophy of religion. Okay. I go on to fourth comment. I'm a bit worried that Horwich's picture of religious belief focuses too much on its earthly benefit. He asserts that religious practices are not world-mapping practices and their norm is not evidential. Instead, according to Horwich, the function of religious practices is to soothe our inner torments. Here's a quotation from on the 100, page 9. Wittgenstein's point once again that the kind of religious belief and assertion that he recommends has a pair of functions. First, to provide illustrations and expressions of a way of life that constrains certain normative attitudes. And second, to be rescued from a profound sense of hopeless isolation, purposelessness, and insecurity. It can be an overwhelmingly natural way of responding to and coping with these inner torments. I think Horwich is correct in saying that religion is a natural way of responding to our inner torments. However, it may not be the only way, or some other practices, say psychotherapy, might be a better candidate for fulfilling that function. The worry here is that if the function of a religious practice is to rescue one from one's inner torments, then we can assess its efficacy by seeing how well it fulfills that function. But this is to see religion as a kind of psychotherapy or something analogous to it. Maybe there is no problem here. And if there is a problem, this is not the problem of Horwich, but problems of Wittgenstein, maybe. But anyway, however, I'm a bit worried that this way of seeing the religion may discredit the value of religious beliefs. And finally, fifth comment, I'm worried that Horwich emphasizes the distinction between religious practice and non-religious practice too much. He asserts that religious practices have known features different from that of scientific practices. However, he says relatively little about how these different practices are related to each other. For example, imagine someone who has a Mary-like attitude towards Christianity, but also engages in natural scientific practices as well. Thus, as a believer, she accepts Christian doctrine of God's creation of the universe, including human beings. But as a scientist, she accepts evolutionary theory and the Big Bang theory. So she can express her belief by saying the God created human beings, and nevertheless human beings are the result of evolutionary process. She, like many believers, may feel uncomfortable with her position. However, it seems that, according to Horwich's picture, her scruple is just the result of philosophical confusion. When she said that God created the human beings and nevertheless human beings are the result of evolutionary process, the first sentence is an expression of a non-cognitive attitude, while the second one is a description of a fact. According to Horwich, these two sentences have different functions, so that there is no tension here. But here I am a bit worried that Horwich takes the scruple of a believer too lightly. I am not sure that this really is a problem, but I think it would be good if we know how he understands the way the religious practice and non-religious practices, such as scientific practices, are interconnected with each other. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiroshi. Those are absolutely fantastic comments, very helpful, very challenging. I'm going to just quickly try and answer. I won't be able to do justice to them, I'm sure. But okay, but thank you. All right. First question has to do with the relationship between the literal meaning of a sentence and what I call the intended communicative significance, which can vary with the same literal meaning. I just, as a more general point, want to say that, you know, it's one thing to say that there is a distinction between two things, and another thing to theorize that distinction and explain exactly, you know, what the distinction is and how the two things relate to each other. I mean, you can, for instance, distinguish between a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. But, you know, and give some reason for thinking there is that distinction, but then there remains the problem of saying, well, exactly how do you spell out the difference, or analytic and synthetic, or whatever it is. So here I'm just saying, look, really I just want to, what's important to me is that there is a difference. Okay, so that, for instance, you know, there is life on Mars. There's a sentence of English. It has a certain meaning, certain literal meaning. But then, you know, in one context, you know, if somebody says it in a movie, you know, a science fiction movie, that's one thing. In another context, it's, you know, a scientific conference where somebody's claiming to have discovered life on Mars. You know, they're different things. Okay, so my important thing is to just insist on that. Now, you're pressing me on the interesting question, how to theorize that. You know, what about the relationship between these sentences and propositions? Does the literal meaning not actually itself give you a proposition, but only in the context, you know, the intended significance gives you a proposition, or do you already have one proposition and then move to another proposition? I don't have a view about that. That's how to theorize it in a formal semantics. But I see the two options you're mentioning. I don't really know. But for my purposes, I just needed to say there is a difference. You know, that's what I mainly wanted to say. Okay. On the second question, has to do with the relationship between what I call assent believing, where you're just prepared to say yes, or just come out with a sentence, and then what I said was a deeper thing, which is I called instrumental believing, where you really act on the thing, you use it in deliberating, trying to decide what to decide. Sorry, trying to decide what to do. Okay, now I agree with you that in most contexts, when you agree to something, when you say yes to something, okay, then it's natural, you know, then you're believing it and you act on it. But I think that's the case when we're only dealing with, the kind of domains I'm calling, world mapping domains. And it's not something that you can really generalize. So in something like fiction or religion, you might say in a fictional context, you might assent to Superman can fly, but not use that instrumentally in your life, So I think, there are contexts where you get some kind of assent, but where doesn't go along with an instrumental belief which you would rely on in deciding what to do. Although generally there is that connection. Okay, third point. Okay, yes, this is the example of implicit belief. So yes, I'm saying sometimes you believe something only implicitly. You don't say anything that articulates the belief, you don't verbalize it or even internally accept a sentence. And I mentioned that one of Wittgenstein's examples was that of somebody who has a tendency to treat everything that happens to her as a reward or a punishment for what she's done. And Wittgenstein suggests that they maybe implicitly believe that there will be a last judgment, but they don't think that. They don't think it or say it. And okay, I see that's, I think that Wittgenstein has, that would overgeneralize, because there may be a lot of people, who have that tendency, and you wouldn't want to say that they believe implicitly in the last judgment. They're not even Christians of any kind. They're in some other religion entirely. I think that, that's strictly speaking correct objection, but I think maybe we could understand Wittgenstein maybe more sympathetically and say maybe he's thinking that that behavior by itself isn't enough. It's part of what we use to say their belief is implicit in that behavior, but there's got to be something more. Namely, that in other ways they display them, in their other behaviors, they display themselves at least to be a Christian. That's the religion they subscribe to. Then that can get you to that particular implicit belief. Whereas if somebody merely had those attitudes, then of course belong to an entirely different, religion. That wouldn't be the appropriate thing. I mean, a more down to earth example of implicit belief, beyond religion, is, in language, where we might say, oh, well, you have an English speaker who has correct beliefs about the way you put words together to get a grammatical sentence. But those beliefs are obviously merely implicit, because he does actually put the words together in a way to make, he couldn't actually say what the rules are. I mean, you'd have to be, not even Chomsky can say that quite. I mean, it's a theoretical, difficult enterprise, so it's an implicit belief. That would be at least less controversial kind of case. Okay, so, all right. So where are we? Moving on to, is it number 4? Okay. Oh yeah, you say, well, look, this is a very nice point you make. So Wittgenstein is urging this form of religiosity that he's recommending as a relief from certain kind of torments. And So, and Hiroshi, you rightly say, well, look, you know, what evidence has he got that that's actually good advice to give to other people, you know? I mean, you might say, okay, in his own personal case, he has found that this way of being religious helps him through these torments. But he's one person with one personality and one history and so on. How can he reasonably push this on other people? As you say, maybe some completely other thing, maybe psychotherapy, maybe something. I agree that, you know, he doesn't really, you know, maybe for close friends of his who he knows very well and can sort of has insight into their nature, he could say, look, this is good for you. But he often puts it as if this is just a general recommendation. People will find this to be some kind of help to them. And, you know, and one might reasonably say, look, the evidence isn't there for that. He's going out on a limb a bit, and I would agree with that point. Fifthly, you say, well, okay, what about, you know, somebody who's religious and also a scientist, and feels a bit of a tension there, but still she says, God created human beings, and nevertheless, human beings are the result of evolutionary processes. And how are we going to understand these kinds of claims? Is it fair to say that this is just confusion? Isn't there something more generous way of putting this, or more understanding way of putting it? I'm not sure I can really see my way through to a good answer. My first reaction, I'm afraid to say, is to stick to my guns a bit. I mean, what this person, really, this imaginary scientist who's religious, is saying, in effect, is God created human beings and God didn't create human beings. So it is basically, you know, looks like an explicit contradiction. You know, the God created human beings, that was the religious part. And the God didn't create human beings, there's a scientist in her. So she's saying these two contradictory things. And I think the only way to really make sense of that is to say, well, she doesn't mean the same thing. Otherwise, it just seems a confusion. It does seem like a confusion. And if this feels like a tension, oh God, you know, I've got to say both, but you know, so I think the only way around it is to say there's a difference in meaning, a difference of intention. And we can unravel the confusion, and I'm sure when we've unraveled it and we've identified the two meanings, she can say, well, I'm feeling this, you know, but I think maybe the confusion would be that she'd have to, if she really wants to hang on to both, she'd have to be adopting a non-scientific interpretation of her religious statement. And I think basically, it maybe would be Wittgenstein's view that you shouldn't come out with these mixed, you know, conjunctions, because it's asking for confusion, you know. I mean, it's just basically asking for it. I mean, it's as if, you know, trivially, if somebody said, look, she's at the bank, but she's not, and she's not at the bank. Well, you know, of course we can resolve it because bank is ambiguous between the financial thing and the river. But nobody would try and communicate with somebody by putting it in that way. You know, it'd just be asking for trouble. You know, so I think maybe, anyway, so I'm afraid that's the best I can do, but thank you for those questions. They're really good ones.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Hiroshi. Next, actually, we are already almost close to the end of the time, but would you mind to extend it a little bit, Paul?
Good. I'm sorry about it. It's my fault. I really hope we can extend it. Or at least I want, not for my sake, but for people who have questions to be able to ask.